This bear only trusted toys, until a bobcat kitten stole her heart. The morning Emma first laid eyes on Maple, she knew this bear would challenge everything she thought she understood about trauma. After 15 years running the Wildwood Sanctuary, Emma had seen her share of broken animals. Wolves with phantom limbs, eagles that had forgotten how to fly, deer that startled at their own shadows. But Maple was different. Maple was silent in a way that felt dangerous, like the calm before a storm that never came. The rescue team had found her in a concrete pit barely large enough for her massive frame. Her body was riddled with the telltale scars of illegal bile extraction. The farm had been operating for decades in the remote mountains of Southeast Asia, and Maple had been there for most of her adult life. When the authorities finally raided the facility, they found her pressed against the back wall of her cage, clutching something white against her chest. A stuffed rabbit, torn, yellowed, and sticky with tree sap from some long-forgotten forest. The rescue team had tried to take it away during the medical examination, but Maple had fought them with a ferocity that surprised everyone. Not the desperate rage of a cornered animal, but the determined strength of a mother protecting her child. They let her keep it. Now, 3 weeks after her arrival at Wildwood, Maple sat in the corner of her spacious enclosure, the rabbit pressed against her side. She hadn't eaten a full meal since arriving. She hadn't made eye contact with any human. She simply existed, breathing slowly, watching the world through eyes that had seen too much. Emma approached the fence with a bowl of fresh salmon, Maple's favorite according to her file. "Hey, girl," she said softly, crouching down. "I brought you something good today." Maple's dark eyes flicked toward Emma, then back to the ground. Her massive paw moved slightly, adjusting her grip on the rabbit's matted fur. Emma placed the bowl near the fence and backed away. She'd learned patience from years of working with traumatized animals, but Maple tested even her. Considerable reserves. The bear would only eat when the rabbit was positioned just so beside her food bowl, and even then, she took only small, mechanical bites, as if eating were simply another task to endure. Martinez, the sanctuary's veterinarian, had warned Emma that some bile bears never fully recovered. The psychological damage ran too deep, carved into their minds like the scars across their bellies. "She might never be the same," he'd said gently. "Some animals are too broken to put back together." But Emma refused to accept that. She'd seen miracles before. A wolf who'd learned to trust again, a hawk who'd remembered how to hunt. Every animal deserved a chance at healing, even those who seemed beyond repair. That afternoon, as autumn rain drummed against the roof of the sanctuary's main building, Emma heard the rumble of another transport truck. She wasn't expecting any new arrivals, but emergencies happened often in her line of work. She pulled on her rain jacket and jogged toward the entrance. The driver, a weathered man named Pete, whom she'd worked with for years, was already unloading a small transport crate. "Found this little guy after that storm last week," he called over. The rain, separated from his mother, dehydrated, scared out of his mind. State wildlife folks thought he might do better here than in the overcrowded rehab center downtown. Emma peered through the crate's metal grating and saw a pair of golden eyes staring back at her. A lynx cub, probably 4 or 5 months old, pressed against the back corner of the crate with his fur standing on end. His ears were flattened against his skull, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. "What's his story?" Emma asked, signing the transport paperwork. "They're calling him Ziggy, after all the zigzag patterns in his coat. Mother was killed by a fallen tree in that big storm we had. He was found 3 days later, half-starved and hiding in a hollow log. He's been aggressive with all the handlers so far. Won't let anyone get close." Emma nodded, studying the frightened cub. She could see the wildness in his eyes, but also something else, a desperate need for safety that he didn't know how to ask for. "We'll get him settled. He just needs time." They carried the crate to a small indoor enclosure in the sanctuary's quarantine building, where new arrivals spent their first few weeks before being integrated into the main facility. Emma opened the crate door and immediately stepped back, as Ziggy bolted for the darkest corner of the room, his small body pressed against the wall. "Take all the time you need, little one," Emma whispered, leaving a bowl of raw chicken near the crate opening. Nobody's going to hurt you here. Over the next several days, Emma watched both animals struggle with their demons. Maple continued her vigil with the stuffed rabbit, eating just enough to survive but showing no interest in her surroundings. Ziggy remained in his corner, emerging only at night to eat and drink when he thought no humans were around. Emma tried everything she could think of: different foods, classical music, even aromatherapy oils that were supposed to have calming effects on stressed animals. Nothing seemed to reach either of them. They were trapped in their own private hells, unable to trust the world that had already betrayed them once. It was on a Wednesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Ziggy's arrival, that Emma noticed something strange. She was doing her morning rounds, checking on all the animals before the volunteer staff arrived, when she caught a scent she didn't recognize in the quarantine building. It was faint but distinct, something wild and musky that didn't belong to any of their current residents. She followed her nose through the building, past the empty enclosures and storage rooms, until she found herself standing outside the door to Ziggy's room. The scent was stronger here, but there was something else too, something that made her heart race with excitement and worry in equal measure. Emma quietly opened the door and peered inside. Ziggy wasn't in his usual corner. Instead, he was pressed against the far wall, his golden eyes fixed on something beyond the room's single window. Emma followed his gaze and felt her breath catch in her throat. The window looked out onto the main enclosure area, where Maple spent her days. The bear was sitting in her usual spot, the white rabbit clutched against her chest, but her head was turned toward the quarantine building. Her nostrils flared slightly, and her ears were pricked forward in a way Emma had never seen before. "Well, I'll be damned," Emma whispered. Somehow, despite the distance and the walls between them, the two animals had detected each other. The predator instincts that should have made them enemies were instead drawing them together. Two damaged souls recognizing something familiar in each other's pain. Emma bowed to a decision that went against every protocol in her sanctuary. Manual. The next morning, after Ziggy had shown 3 consecutive days of steady eating and reduced aggression, she moved him to a small enclosure adjacent to Maple's. She told herself it was for observation purposes, to see how they would react to each other's proximity, but deep down she knew she was hoping for something more. Some spark of connection that might help them both begin to heal. The first day of their new arrangement was tense. Maple seemed agitated by Ziggy's presence, pacing along the fence line that separated their enclosures while clutching her rabbit more tightly than usual. Ziggy, meanwhile, alternated between cowering in a shelter and stalking along his own fence line, his predatory instincts warring with his fear. Emma watched from a distance, ready to intervene if necessary. But as the hours passed, something subtle began to shift. Maple's pacing became more purposeful, almost like patrolling, and Ziggy's stalking took on a different quality. Less aggressive, more curious. By evening, they had settled into a routine. Maple would position herself near the shared fence, the rabbit beside her, and simply sit. Ziggy would emerge from his shelter and sit on his side of the fence, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly interested in his massive neighbor. They didn't interact, not yet, but they were aware of each other in a way that felt significant. Emma made notes in her daily log, documenting every subtle behavior change, every moment of what might have been progress. It was 3 days. Later, during one of those crisp October nights when the first frost painted the sanctuary ground silver, that the real breakthrough happened. Emma was doing her final security check, walking the perimeter of the facility with her flashlight, when she heard something that made her stop in her tracks. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of the usual sounds. No rustling from Maple's enclosure, no soft growls from Ziggy's shelter, just silence, heavy and expectant. Emma crept toward the enclosures, moving as quietly as her thick boots would allow. She clicked off her flashlight and waited for her eyes to adjust to the moonlight. What she saw made her heart nearly stop. Ziggy had somehow managed to squeeze through a gap in the fence separating the two enclosures. A gap Emma would have sworn was too small for even a cub his size. He was now on Maple's side, moving with the silent grace that only cats possess. His golden eyes were fixed on something near Maple's sleeping form, the white rabbit. Maple was lying on her side, apparently asleep, but Emma could see the slight tension in her body that suggested she was very much aware of the intruder in her space. The rabbit lay beside her, though, within easy reach of her massive paws, but also tantalizingly close to where Ziggy crouched. Emma held her breath, waiting for the explosion of violence that seemed inevitable. A frightened lynx cub and a traumatized bear, both with every reason to distrust the world, facing off over the one thing that had kept Maple anchored to sanity. But instead of attacking, Ziggy did something extraordinary. He approached the rabbit with infinite care, his movements slow and deliberate. When he was close enough to touch it, he lowered his head and gently, almost reverently, touched his nose to one of the rabbit's torn ears. Maple's eyes snapped open. Emma tensed, ready to shout a warning, to throw herself between the animals if necessary. But Maple didn't growl or swipe. She simply looked at Ziggy. Their eyes met for a long moment, charged with significance. Then, with deliberate slowness, Maple pulled the rabbit closer to her body and tucked her head down beside it. Not aggressive, not territorial, protective. She was sharing her most precious possession, acknowledging Ziggy's presence without surrendering. What kept her grounded? Ziggy backed away respectfully, but he didn't return to his own enclosure. Instead, he settled down a few feet away, just close enough to remain part of the moment, but far enough to respect Maple's boundaries. Emma watched them for another hour, documenting this impossible scene in her memory. When she finally crept away, leaving them to their quiet vigil, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months of working with these two animals: hope. The changes began slowly, like the first tentative shoots of spring breaking through winter earth. Over the following weeks, Emma watched as Maple and Ziggy developed their own peculiar rhythm of interaction. Ziggy had somehow made Maple's enclosure his permanent home. Emma suspected he was using the same gap in the fence, though she could never quite figure out how he managed it. Rather than separate them, she decided to officially combine their living spaces. It went against conventional wisdom. Mixing species was always risky, especially with animals as traumatized as these two. But conventional wisdom hadn't helped either of them so far. Dr. Martinez was skeptical when Emma proposed the arrangement. "A bear and a lynx," he said, raising his eyebrows. "Emma, I know you've worked miracles before, but this seems like a recipe for disaster." "If something goes wrong, we'll deal with it," Emma replied firmly. "But right now they're helping each other. I can see it." And she could. Ziggy had begun bringing small offerings to Maple. Bits of moss, interesting, rocks, feathers from the sanctuary's resident ravens. He would place these treasures near where Maple spent her days, then retreat to watch her reaction. Maple, for her part, had stopped destroying these gifts. She wouldn't play with them or touch them, but she would examine them carefully before adding them to a small pile beside her sleeping area. More importantly, Maple had begun to eat more regularly. Not enthusiastically, not with any apparent pleasure, but consistently. Emma noticed that she ate better when Ziggy was nearby, as if the cub's presence provided some form of comfort or distraction from the internal battles she was fighting. The breakthrough came on a cold November morning when Emma arrived at the sanctuary to find Ziggy engaged in what could only be described as a one-sided game of catch. He had found a rubber ball, probably left behind by a volunteer's child, and was batting it around the enclosure with typical feline enthusiasm. The ball bounced off walls, rolled across the ground, and occasionally came to rest near where Maple sat with her rabbit. On this particular morning, the ball rolled directly to Maple's feet, instead of ignoring it, as she had done with all of Ziggy's previous offerings. She reached out with one massive paw and gave it a tentative push. The ball rolled back toward Ziggy, who pounced on it with delighted energy before batting it back in Maple's direction. For a moment, a brief, shining moment, they were playing together. Emma felt tears prick her eyes as she watched this simple interaction. It wasn't much, not by normal standards, But for these two damaged souls, it represented a monumental step forward. Maple was engaging with the world again, responding to something beyond her own pain and fear. The game didn't last long. After a few exchanges, Maple retreated to her corner with the rabbit, and Ziggy returned to his solitary play. But the precedent had been set. They could connect. They could find moments of joy together, even in the midst of their healing. As the days grew shorter and the first snows began to dust the sanctuary grounds, Emma watched their relationship deepen in ways that defied every textbook she'd ever read about animal behavior. Ziggy had taken on an almost protective role with Maple, positioning himself between her and any perceived threats, including Emma and the other staff members. Not aggressively, but with a quiet vigilance that spoke of deep loyalty. Maple, meanwhile, had begun to show signs of what Emma could only describe as maternal behavior toward the cub. She would share her food with him, nudge him toward warmer spots in their enclosure when the weather turned cold, and position her large body to shield him from wind and rain. Most remarkably, Maple had begun to set the white rabbit aside for periods of time. She still slept with it and kept it close during her most vulnerable moments, but she no longer clutched it constantly. Instead, she would place it carefully beside her nest, like a treasured memory, rather than a desperate lifeline. Emma documented every change, every small victory in her detailed logs. She was building a case study that she hoped might help other sanctuaries working with similarly traumatized animals. But more than that, she was witnessing something beautiful. The slow, painful, miraculous process of healing. December brought the first real test of their bond. A massive winter storm system was moving through the region, bringing with it the threat of wildfires driven by unseasonably warm winds. Emma had been through fire evacuations before and knew the drill. All animals would need to be loaded into transport vehicles and moved to a temporary facility 2 hours north. The evacuation order came late one night. Emma and her skeleton crew of volunteers had 90 minutes to load 37 animals and get them to safety. It was controlled chaos. Carriers and crates being loaded into trucks, frightened animals calling out to each other across the darkness, the acrid smell of distant smoke beginning to tint the air. Emma saved Maple and Ziggy for last, knowing they would be the most challenging to move. When she reached their enclosure, she found them huddled together in the back corner. Maple's massive form curved protectively around Ziggy's smaller body. The white rabbit sat beside them, almost glowing in the harsh beam of Emma's flashlight. "Come on, guys," Emma called softly, opening the enclosure door. "We need to go. I know it's scary, but we'll all be together." Ziggy looked up at her with wide golden eyes, but didn't move away from Maple's embrace. Maple, for her part, seemed to sense the urgency in Emma's voice. She lifted her great head and looked directly at Emma, the first time she had made sustained eye contact since arriving at the sanctuary. In that moment, Emma saw something in Maple's eyes that took her breath away. Not fear, not resignation, determination. Maple understood that danger was coming, and she was ready to face it. The bear rose to her feet with deliberate slowness, then did something Emma would remember for the rest of her life. She bent down, gently grasped Ziggy by the scruff of his neck, the way a mother cat would carry a kitten, and lifted him. Ziggy went completely limp, trusting himself entirely to this massive creature who had once been a stranger. With Ziggy dangling safely from her mouth, Maple walked toward the enclosure door. She paused only once, looking back at the white rabbit sitting alone in the corner. For a moment, Emma thought Maple might go back for it, might refuse to leave, without the one possession that had sustained her through her darkest hours. But instead, Maple turned back toward the door and walked out into the smoky night, carrying Ziggy to safety. She was no longer the frightened animal who needed protection. She had become the protector. The temporary facility was crowded and chaotic, filled with animals from multiple sanctuaries and rescue organizations. Emma worried about how Maple and Ziggy would handle the stress of being surrounded by so many unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells. But her concerns proved unfounded. Maple adapted to their temporary quarters with remarkable grace, establishing a small territory in one corner of their assigned space and maintaining her protective watch over Ziggy. The cub, meanwhile, seemed to draw confidence from Maple's calm presence, exploring their new environment with cautious curiosity, rather than the paralyzing fear Emma had expected. They spent 4 days at the evacuation facility before getting the all-clear to return. The sanctuary had been spared any serious damage. Though the smell of smoke still lingered in the air when they arrived back at Wildwood, Emma was exhausted from the stress of evacuation and the logistics of moving so many animals. But she made sure to check on Maple and Ziggy as soon as they were settled back in their enclosure. What she found there stopped her in her tracks. The white rabbit was exactly where Maple had left it. The white rabbit sat in the corner like a patient guardian, waiting for its owner's return. But when Maple entered the enclosure, she didn't go to it right away. Instead, she conducted a slow, thorough inspection of the space, checking every corner and crevice as if ensuring it was safe for Ziggy. Only when she was satisfied did she approach the rabbit. Gently, she picked it up in her mouth and carried it to a high shelf Emma had installed for enrichment purposes. She placed it there with care, not discarded, not forgotten, but elevated. It was no longer a desperate comfort object, but something transformed, a quiet monument to survival. Emma understood the symbolism immediately. Maple didn't need the rabbit to cling to anymore. She had found something stronger, purpose. She had someone who depended on her, and that gave her a reason to be strong. As winter deepened, the bond between the unlikely pair only grew stronger. Emma often found them curled up together, Maple's massive form wrapped protectively around Ziggy like a living fortress. During the day, they had invented their own games, blending the playful instincts of both bear and lynx, chasing, pouncing, even gentle wrestling matches that looked fierce to an outsider but never caused harm. Ziggy had grown over the months. His kittenish features had given way to the lithe, muscular body of a juvenile lynx. The wild desperation in his golden eyes had softened into something steadier, more confident. Emma credited that transformation entirely to Maple's presence. And Maple, she had changed even more. Her once patchy, dull coat now gleamed, thick and rich with health. She had filled out, no longer the gaunt creature who had arrived at the sanctuary, but the magnificent bear she was meant to be. Most importantly, she was awake to the world again. She explored, noticed, even tolerated brief, quiet interactions with Emma and the volunteer staff. That spring came early, warming the earth and awakening the sanctuary with new life. One morning, Emma noticed something odd. Maple was restless, pacing more than usual, frequently retreating into the den-like structure in the corner of her enclosure. At first, Emma feared a setback, stress, illness, some return of past trauma. But Dr. Martinez's exam revealed something extraordinary. Maple was pregnant. "It's almost impossible," Dr. Martinez said, flipping through his notes. "Female. Bile bears almost never regain reproductive capacity after what they've endured. The hormonal damage, the trauma, it usually renders them sterile. But Maple, she's thriving." Emma sat with the news, her emotions overwhelming. After everything Maple had survived, every scar, every heartbreak, she was going to have cubs of her own. It felt like the ultimate affirmation of everything they'd done, the choices they'd made, the risks they'd taken. The pregnancy went smoothly. Maple became more protective of her space, more wary of the humans around her, but she never once excluded Ziggy. If anything, his presence seemed to soothe her. She would rest with him nearby, draw comfort from his quiet companionship. Ziggy responded with his usual attentiveness, offering her morsels of food and standing watch over their shared home with even more care. Then, on a warm May morning, as the sanctuary buzzed with the energy of new life, birds chirping, young animals tumbling through sunlit grass, Emma discovered the birth. She found Maple in the den, nursing 2 tiny, perfect cubs. Above them, on the shelf, the white rabbit sat in silent vigil, a witness to this miracle. Emma stood at a distance and watched. Maple's movements were patient, practiced. She cleaned and fed her cubs with the grace of an experienced mother. Ziggy lay nearby, quiet and calm, like a guardian uncle. As the days passed and the cubs grew, Emma saw something she hadn't dared to hope for. Maple had not just recovered, she had transformed. Each gentle nudge, every protective gesture told the story of a spirit reborn. The cubs thrived, bold, curious, joyful. They pounced on each other, climbed everything in sight, and made a game of tumbling over Maple's broad back. Ziggy played too, teaching them strange hybrid games that blended the hunting finesse of a lynx with the roughhousing instincts of bears. One golden afternoon, nearly a year after Ziggy had first arrived, Emma sat on a bench overlooking the enclosure. Maple was dozing in a patch of sun, her cubs clambering all over her like furry whirlwinds. Ziggy perched on a nearby log, eyes alert, tail twitching contentedly as he supervised the chaos. High on the shelf, the white rabbit watched in silence. It no longer stood for desperation or grief. It was a marker of a journey, one that had begun in pain but had blossomed into something miraculous. Healing, Emma had learned, didn't mean forgetting what hurt you. It meant growing strong enough to carry it and to turn it into something better. As Emma watched, one of the cubs clambered onto Ziggy's back. The lynx rose slowly and began to walk in slow circles, giving the little one a ride. Maple opened one eye, regarded the scene for a moment with what could only be described as quiet amusement, then settled back into her nap. Emma opened her notebook and began to write. Not just observations, feelings, reflections. This wasn't just a case study anymore. It was a love story. A story of survival, of broken beings who had found their way back to wholeness, not through solitude, but through connection. In the fading amber light of that perfect autumn day, Emma saw what she had hoped for but never fully expected. Maple and Ziggy had found a home. Not just a place to live, but a place to thrive, to love, to become something greater than they could have been alone. And watching over it all from its shelf, the white rabbit remained, silent testimony to the truth Emma now held close. Sometimes the most broken things can be mended into something even more beautiful than they were before.